Hello, everyone. We'll give it another minute as people join the room, and then we'll get started. Thank you for being here.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll get the slides back up. And thank you for joining us today for this webinar presentation, Changing the Culture to Address Officer-Involved Domestic Violence. My name is Michael Rizzo. I work for the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, and I oversee the training and technical assistance for the Office on Violence Against Women's National Violence Against Women Law Enforcement Training and Technical Assistance Consortium, also known as LETTAC. I would like to thank the Office on Violence Against Women, OVW, for the cooperative agreement that supported this event and for their commitment to strengthening law enforcement efforts responding to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and other crimes, including the complex issue we're going to talk about today, which is officer-perpetrated domestic violence. LETTAC provides no cost support for law enforcement and partner organizations. I'm just going to repeat that. It's no cost for law enforcement and partner organizations for training and technical assistance focused on gender-based violence and intimate partner crimes. We have an extensive clearinghouse of resources, webinars, and tools on our webpage, which is on the slide there, and support law enforcement all over the country on these complex issues of gender-based violence. Please visit the webpage to access the resources and to read more about our training and technical assistance. I do want to thank also not just OVW, but the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, NALI, for collaborating with us on this event and hosting us here today. This is a much needed conversation, and I want to thank Dottie Davis for being our speaker today. Throughout this event, we do hope that you will put questions and engage with us in the chat. If we don't get to them today, we will follow up with you. Definitely reach out to us, though, individually if you have questions or need more resources on these or other related issues. I'll turn it over to Josh Bronson, who is at NALI, for introductions and some additional information about logistics.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all of you for being with us today. My name is Josh Bronson. I'm the Chief of Staff for the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, or NALI, and I'm honored to be able to welcome you here today. For those of you not familiar with NALI, we are a law enforcement membership association whose mission it is to serve and further the interests of women executives and those who aspire to be executives in law enforcement. We accomplish this through a number of programs and activities throughout the year related to mentoring, grant programs and partnerships, our annual conference, which is coming up in April 2025 in Orlando. We hope to see you all there, and many other events such as this one today. I encourage you to go to www.nawlee.org to learn more. Some quick housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared within the next few business days. Please feel free to use the Q&A or chat features to ask questions throughout the webinar. Introduce yourselves, talk amongst yourselves. We want this to be interactive as possible. We will answer these questions throughout and hope to have a little time at the end to answer any we didn't get to. Now to the reason we are all here today. Officer-involved domestic violence is a far too often overlooked topic in policing. The women and men who are out in our communities deserve better than this, and we need to do more to elevate the urgency of this conversation. I'm thrilled to be part of LETTAC and working with dedicated people like Michael and Dottie so that NALI can help lead the way on addressing this crisis in policing. This is an officer safety and wellness issue, as well as a community trust issue, and we all have a role to play to ensure our personnel are safe within their own agencies. With that, I will turn things over to Deputy Chief Dottie Davis, who will lead our discussion today. Chief Davis?
Thank you so much, Michael and Josh, for the introduction and for this opportunity. For those of you who may not be familiar with me, and I'm very excited by the numbers of people who have joined today, and those of you who I already know on the call. But for those who don't, I spent 32 years in law enforcement in an agency in Northern Indiana with approximately 500 officers. And I was fortunate enough to be able to rise through the ranks. And I left my career still loving law enforcement. So this topic is extremely important to me as we continue to push for systemic change and better law enforcement agencies serving our communities. So I always start with my presentations by stating this, that I have a growth mindset. And as a trainer, it is my responsibility to be a lifelong learner and to make sure that I'm addressing the needs of the people who are attending, as well as making sure that I'm providing information that comes from reliable resources and information based on research. And so if you have a question about anything that I state, you want to know where it comes from, if I use language that may not be inclusive, please hold me accountable today and in the future. So we have a lot to accomplish in an hour, and to tell you that we're only going to scratch the surface is so accurate. And I'm hopeful that this is only the beginning of this conversation, because it is beyond time for us to move the needle on this topic. We must acknowledge that law enforcement families are not exempt from domestic violence. We'll look at all the barriers that exist today and have been the same barriers for at least 2 decades that I've been working in this field. The barriers that keep us from addressing officer-involved DV, but I'm a glass half full kind of person, so I'm not going to leave you here today by just talking about obstacles. I will identify, and we together will look at solvability factors to address this issue, not only in our own agencies, but statewide and nationwide. And then lastly, I want to make sure that we give you an example of messaging from a chief who recently had to address an arrest of an officer, and the words that he chose to let the community know that police are not above the law. So I had an opportunity, Josh sent us today an Excel spreadsheet much earlier though than with how many people we know we're going to be joining. So if I could I get you all to put in the chat box, who do you represent? I want to make sure that we have a good cross-section of individuals here. And Michael, if you could maybe just shout out some of the responses for me.
We have 911. Community advocate. A victim service unit. Department of Labor. So now they're coming in fast. DV counselors, public safety. More victim advocates.
Awesome.
Victim services. Yep. Looks like some training coordinators.
Well, I'm very happy, first of all, that 911 dispatchers, telecommunicators have come to the table. You are our first line of defense, not only on this type of call for service, but all calls for service. And oftentimes you are an afterthought. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the advocates, to the trainers here as well. And I hope that you will engage us in this conversation today. So the question is this: if you are aware of an officer-involved domestic violence case in your county or state, would you please put yes in the chat box? And as I put this slide together, I got to thinking that maybe I should have said, if you're not aware of one, put it in the chat box, because most on the call are here for a reason, not just to learn, but also to maybe be able to react differently or with more information in the future when there is such a case. Let me say this. About a month to 2 months ago, at the very most, I became introduced to a father whose daughter was murdered at the hands of a fellow police officer. And he asked this question: How can I help? What can I do? And I said, I'm very busy putting together presentations, attending conferences, and we really need some new data. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I would like to do a search of all 50 states to look for any officer-involved domestic violence case in every state within the last 2 years. Do you think you would have the time to do that? Sadly, within just days, he responded to me and said that was an easy task. It was not difficult at all to be able to create this Excel spreadsheet with at least one example from every state here in the US. Now, even though we had a list of 50, if I told you that less than half were either terminated, resigned, would that surprise you? As we look at the data today, you will see that those outcomes are generally the case is dismissed and the person retains their employment within the law enforcement agency. Michael, did you get a lot of yeses in the chat box?
Yes, a lot of yeses came in. I didn't see any no's, but just a lot of yeses.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so I think language matters. And when we as law enforcement personnel or prosecutors or advocates talk about someone who has been arrested for, is a suspect in, or has been perpetrating domestic violence, we don't call them involved. Involved to me means that they showed up and they were a witness to it, or they had information about the situation. Advocates have actually shifted their language when talking about those who have experienced domestic violence, those who have been victimized by domestic violence, and we call those individuals survivors. And yet, when it comes to officers who perpetrate domestic violence within their intimate relationships, most policies are titled officer involved domestic violence and not officer perpetrated. Most of you are familiar with the power and control wheel developed by Duluth, Minnesota back in the 1980s. I believe, to be exact, it was 1984. The power and control wheel, where the center of this wheel shows you that the root cause of domestic violence is in fact power and control. And on the exterior, on the outside of that wheel, on that Duluth model, you'll have sexual assault and physical assault. And then you have all these different spokes that give you the characteristics or dynamics of what you may be looking for in a situation in which domestic violence has been perpetrated. I, along with Diane Wettendorf, worked to massage that power and control wheel from the Duluth, Minnesota project and create an officer perpetrated domestic violence wheel. Now, this was created back in the 1990s, early 2000s, it was probably early 2000s. And I will tell you at that time, we had only identified male officers as perpetrators. At that time, we were looking at about 8% women in law enforcement, and we had not really identified that female officers could also be perpetrators. And I know that to be true now. I have been informed of, have looked at cases involving female officers who were perpetrators. However, we still know the numbers. About 12% of female officers are involved in law enforcement, and even fewer are involved in perpetrated domestic violence. If you look at the statistics nationally, we know that most perpetrators of domestic violence are in fact men. So the language does need to be updated on this today, and I will be working on getting that done. But we wanted you to see that there are different facets and characteristics of domestic violence when officers are involved versus a civilian that doesn't have the same resources, access to information, or the ability to control a person just because they wear a uniform. When I left law enforcement After 32 years, I believed that it was a noble profession. I still believe that today. However, we would all be sorely remiss if we did not say that it is up to us to police our own. If we want our communities to find us to be legitimate, to be trustworthy, that means that we have to not only have a policy on this subject, but we actually have to enforce the policy, and we have to enforce it equitably to all and not to just to a few, or not just to those who are not well liked or in the in-group by the administration. We have to do this not only to hold offenders accountable within law enforcement, but also to identify and retain those officers who may in fact be a victim of domestic violence within their own homes at the hands of a fellow police officer. That means that we have to address both culture and climate. It's not enough to have a policy. The culture is those longstanding, those values and beliefs, those elevator speeches with our vision and our mission statement. But the climate is about, what do we really tolerate? What do we allow to happen with our agency and turn a blind eye to it? What is practice and what is accepted? It's like having an informal policy underneath that written policy. Yes, we have the written one, but this is really what we do. And individuals can feel and understand that climate, and that can prohibit not only victims from coming forward, but other officers from reporting another officer that they know to be involved in domestic violence within their relationship. So a lot of our obstacles is this. People want to know, how is this affecting us? What is the data behind it? And the research is quite old. Lenore Boulin Johnson actually testified in 1991. And if you recall, it was this research that really pressed the Lautenberg Amendment. The Lautenberg Amendment says that if an officer or military personnel or any individual who has been found guilty of a crime involving domestic violence, they lose the right to carry or possess for life. Now, many state statutes don't mirror that federal statute. The United States Constitution 18 subsection 922G that prohibits that possession of firearm. State of Indiana says after a 5-year conviction, you can come back before the court to have your Second Amendment right restored. So not only is data not available, but our state statutes oftentimes don't match federal statutes. So that is an obstacle for us when we talk about this subject. And then going back to the Lautenberg Amendment, when agencies realize they've invested all this time and money in recruitment and training this person, this individual, to have them convicted of a crime and then lose the right to carry, it means they could lose their certification, not be able to be a police officer in a time like today when we are hungry for personnel. We're hungry for recruits for our classes, and we are hungry for officers out on the street. And so oftentimes agencies will overlook minor indiscretions. And I hope you see me making the air quotes, because there is no such thing as a minor indiscretion when it comes to domestic violence perpetrated by a law enforcement officer. More recent research out of Bowling Green University. You can read the data for yourself. The part that I want to point out the most is that of all of these cases that were looked at in this 2013 research, police officers who were arrested, charged, and convicted of domestic violence, more than half kept their jobs. And so for prosecuting attorneys on the call, it's imperative that we don't plead down domestic battery charges, because if they plead to a disorderly conduct, they plead to obstruction of justice, they plead to a battery and not a domestic battery, then the Lautenberg Act doesn't apply to the situation. They're no longer convicted of a crime involving domestic violence, and therefore they don't lose their their right to carry a firearm and can maintain their certifications in your state. So prosecutors, we need you. And I know it's an obstacle for you because you need law enforcement. You need law enforcement to successfully prosecute your cases. And so you don't want to make them angry. You don't want to offend them. You need to work cooperatively with them. But what if? What if we make exceptions to the rule? Not only does that question the legitimacy of law enforcement, but it also brings into question the legitimacy of the prosecuting attorney's office in your county and state. So I've been training on this subject matter for quite some time. Sadly, I can tell you that I still get the same attitude. Like, I've never had a case involving any of our officers. We don't have that problem within our agency. I recall very painfully being in a fairly large Western state, doing a presentation on officer-involved domestic violence, and a neighboring sheriff made this statement to the news media. I can 110% guarantee you that I don't employ any batterers on my agency. Oops. You want to guess what happened? The victims, they were emboldened by that statement, and they came forward and they started to report and they started to tell stories. And so rather than say, I don't have any, you might say, none has been brought to my attention. If we do have a case, I will investigate it thoroughly and it will be turned over to the prosecutor's office. So folks are mostly uninterested in this topic. I am covered under a grant through another program here in the state of Indiana, and we offer OIDV training throughout the state of Indiana to chief, sheriff, superintendents, and I have to beg to be able to get put into a classroom to hold this training because there just isn't any interest in it because they don't employ any officers who perpetrate this within their home. I go back to this book that I've read that I use quite often in training, and it's about The Power of Noticing by Max Bazerman. And he says that, some people, they just have ambiguity about the situation. They don't believe that it is a problem that affects them until it does, or they're motivated by blindness. Those who may be the likely perpetrators of domestic violence within the agency that they've identified either through early warning systems, through information from a report that was filed through victim advocates, or some other means. They have a self-interest because this is one of the people in their in-group, or they like this officer, or maybe this officer had tons of commendations and there's such a smokescreen that they don't want to believe that this could be a truthful situation. And so there's this, it's better for me not to have a pulse on this and to look elsewhere at problems rather than things that are right in front of me. I highly encourage you to pick up that book because it goes right along with ethics and policing. Who notices and who doesn't, and why do good people turn a blind eye to really bad situations? So as I said in the beginning, when I started, I'm a glass half full kind of person. So I want to start talking about not obstacles, but how do we start to solve this issue? How do we make sure that we are in fact a legitimate law enforcement agency policing their own? And we have to start with policy. In the early 2000s, well, actually in 1999, the International Association of Chiefs of Police wrote and issued a model policy on officer-involved DV. And then in 2003, at the bequest of many people who worked within law enforcement, they revised that policy to identify that, in fact, we could have victims of domestic violence at the hands of a police officer working within our own agency. The original policy said that if you had knowledge of and did not bring forward the information about an officer-involved DV case, that you risked risk up to termination. So basically, we were saying that if you were a victim and you didn't report yourself, that you could be fired. Talk about not being able to retain women in law enforcement. So IACP revised that policy in 2003. And I recall about 2018, I reached out to IACP and I asked this question: how many agencies adopted your model policy when it was released? And their reply was this at the time: I don't really want to put stock in any numbers because many agencies have adopted the policy, but what we really need to know, how many of them are actually enforcing the policy. And along with enforcement has got to be training. So I recall when I wrote our policy back in the early 2000s, and our policy models Indiana law. So many policies will use the words zero tolerance. What does that really mean? I made sure that we actually identified what zero tolerance meant. And that meant that in the state of Indiana, in order for an officer to effect a Class A misdemeanor without the victim's consent, we had to have a visible sign of injury or complaint of pain. We still have that same probable cause here in the state of Indiana. So our policy was written in that fashion. So a shove that did not result in a visible sign of injury or complaint of pain may not meet a zero tolerance policy. I bring that up to you because if that is your language, what does that really mean? Are you really going to terminate? Highly unlikely, an officer who does not cause injury, but it is brought to your attention. And what is your opportunity to either change, to retain, to make sure that you address that issue so it does not escalate to the level of a criminal offense? That may not be how your state statute reads. So I ask you to look at those few things as you develop your policy or breathe new life into it. Question is then, when was that policy updated? When was it last trained on? And when was it last enforced? So training cannot be a one and done. It needs to be provided in the academy, but just not for new recruits. And I will tell you, I train at all of our recruit academies in the state of Indiana, with the exception of 2. And I keep saying with the younger generation, things are going to be different, that they will understand domestic violence. My work will be done. I won't have to explain a DV 101, but the fact of the matter is, it's just not true. So training has to be provided to all new recruits, but I also think it is imperative that our victim advocates and our internal affairs offices, or whoever is given the assignment, that we meet with the significant others, with the spouses of our recruits, to inform them about our policy, to inform them about their resources, to inform them that we will take this matter seriously and that we are there for them and for family members. All newly promoted supervisors, our first line supervision is the weakest link in law enforcement, because it's so hard to transition from being a peer into now I'm your supervisor and now I have to enforce policy and procedure. That means that we've got to give them the words, we've got to give them the tools, we have to teach them how to properly investigate. And going back to policy, maybe your policy says that if it's an officer involved from your agency, that it gets turned over to a neighboring jurisdiction, to the state, to the county, whoever another municipality may be, to conduct that investigation. And I would also ask that you consider that your policy says it's a one-up protocol. So if this is an officer, it's a sergeant who is investigating at the scene. If it's a sergeant, it's a lieutenant. If it's the chief, you're contacting the neighboring sheriff's office for them to do the investigation. You cannot investigate your own chief and do it without any problems of transparency or coming into question that you are not investigating it thoroughly. And then we would be totally remiss if we did not provide training to all of those people listed in the third bullet. I will show you a case in just a moment where a chaplain had information about the domestic violence that was occurring within this officer's home. And he believed that he had the right to confidentiality. And no chaplain has the right to confidentiality if it is admitted that there has been a crime involved within that officer's home or in their personal lives. And dispatch, we need to make sure that you have all the tools and know exactly who to call, and also make sure that we're monitoring what is being put out on our MDTs, on the computers, because other people are having side conversation about that, and all of that is admissible. That 911 call is discoverable, so we have to provide that training to our dispatchers as well. And then civilian review boards, safety boards. I recall one of our members of the safety board saying to me, so you're telling me that all she has to do is file a complaint that this officer put hands on her and caused injury and we're supposed to terminate them? I just can't believe that to be true. So if they start with a position of disbelief, then does that taint the investigation? Does that stop them from being able to hear the evidence? Does that prohibit them from being able to make the decision of termination if the facts lie where they lie? So our hiring process is extremely important. Now is not the time for us to put aside all of our checks and balances in hiring. That means that we either pay up front to do thorough background investigations or pay later because we chose to just hire any warm body who was applying, who passed the physical fitness standards. We need experienced and trained investigators who are traveling too, especially if this is a lateral hire. I have found that many organizations are more than happy to get rid of their unethical, less than stellar officers to be able to sweep all of that information that we need to know under the rug to just get them to join your agency. I will tell you, I know firsthand that we hired an officer on our department who literally punched his sergeant in the face and got a 13-day suspension. And his agency gave us a glowing review and told us what date he was employed from and to. Here's another clue about that applicant. On the day he arrived for his interview, he showed up driving a car with expired plates. That's a clue. If they're willing to show up while they're going through the process, violating the law, why are we giving them a pass just because it's an infraction? That means that we've got to go to their towns, to their cities. We've got to talk to their spouses, their former intimate partners, to their previous employers face to face. I will tell you, if you send a form, they're going to tell you exactly that. They worked here from this date to that date, and they will give you little other information. But if you go face to face, if nothing else, you get great nonverbals that will allow you to ask further questions. You need to search for protective orders and no contact orders. And yes, there may be many where you will see there was one filed and it was dismissed. For those of us who've worked in the domestic violence field for a long time, we know that 85% of our victims will recant. And we know that if their perpetrator is an officer, they have even more reason to recant, because it's not just that they could be criminally charged, but they could in fact lose their job and lose their pension. And that fear of retribution, if they do continue forward with this case, then they have a lot to pay. They have a lot to worry about. Their situational awareness and that stalking, all of those things have to be elevated, or will be elevated, I should say, if an officer is involved and they're put on administrative leave. I had an applicant who applied, and we always look at debt ratio, and he had listed a child as his dependent. But then I asked him about him paying child support. It wasn't listed as a debt. And he advised me that no, he had willfully terminated his parental rights. And I said, well, you didn't list your ex-wife's name. What is her name? And he said, oh, it doesn't matter. You'll never find her. I hope you all can see my face. I'm like, where does she live? She lived in a town that was a farming community in Northwest Indiana, and he didn't want me to find her. I found her. I not only found her, I found her father. And of course, there was domestic violence background. He didn't want me to find her because he didn't want me to have that information. And then if they are former military, they have to supply you their DD 214. So the Department of Defense Form 214. On that form, it'll tell you if they had an honorable or dishonorable discharge. But more important than those words are the little codes behind that, that whether or not they were released with an honorable or dishonorable discharge. Those codes, a JAG officer, a military officer can assist you with what those codes mean. I was lucky enough to come alongside and meet a couple of command personnel who are willing to share with me those discharge codes so that I actually could know more about that and could use that for our background investigation, as well as supply that information to our psychologists or psychiatrists that we had hired and contracted with to do a psychological interview, as well as in our state, we're required to do the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's about a 600 question screener. We would have them tell us whether or not we should move forward with this candidate. And anytime I would get pushback as to, but yeah, it's not a pure science. So it could go either way, right, Dottie? And I would say, we just paid this expert to give us an opinion whether or not we should hire this candidate. I think that we can hang our hat on their opinion because they're an expert. And I don't think we should override them because of nepotism or because somebody has made a contribution to the mayor or whatever else political reason may be involved. I will tell you 2 times I was told to override the psychologist's recommendation. And both times those hires came back to bite us. One in particular committed burglaries while on duty in his squad car. And the other one was involved in some pretty heinous actions as well. So why pay for an expert if we're just not even going to pay attention to them?
Dottie,
yes, please.
we have a question that I think would be relevant to the slide you were just on to talk about. That's a great question. It's from Natasha. The question is, do most police agencies have a policy or SOP to conduct annual restraining order internal audits on all members?
That is a remarkable question, and my answer is no. And the reason why I say that, until the officer is actually served with that protective order, and most departments, as larger departments for sure, but most agencies will have a policy that says if you are the subject of a protective order or no contact order, you must notify the Office of Professional Standards or Internal Affairs Division. But for them to actually just run every officer in a database, I don't believe that is happening. That's maybe one more solvability factor though, so I like that. Thank you. All right, early warning systems. The early warning system is not just to be able to terminate officers. Early warning system is about intervening when we have an opportunity to change the trajectory of this officer's career. That means that we're looking at officer safety and well-being, and that includes identification, intervention, and then monitoring. So not only just identifying it, making sure we're putting solvability factors or items in place to address the issue, but that we're continually monitoring for a period of time afterwards. It's no different than safety planning on a person we believe to be suicidal. We don't just put a safety plan in place and say, there you go. We constantly follow up on and make sure that this person is doing well a week after, 30 days after, 6 months after, until we feel comfortable this person is in a better place. So red flags are there. Red flags, somebody who's constantly signing up for excessive overtime, they're late for duty, there's absenteeism, especially if it's their first or last day, those are warning signs. They get rudeness complaints, improper conduct complaints, and excessive force. Excessive force should be monitored by your Office of Professional Standards, and they should be looking at those cases to make sure whether or not that policy and procedure on the use of force within the agency applies, and that they did not use force unnecessarily or did not raise the level of force used against the person that they were encountering unnecessarily. So some of the interventions that I've seen used throughout my years is that if they're on probation, now's the time to extend that probation. If they are already off of supervised field training, they may still be on probation for that first year of hire. That's an appropriate time to put them back into a probationary status and to make sure that we look at specialized training to identify how do we address this issue and how do we try to make positive change so that this does not rise to the level of a criminal offense. Performance review with their supervisor. I hate that many agencies have stopped doing evaluations because they're cumbersome or because the system is broken. Let's fix the system, but let's continue to evaluate officers. Evaluation should not be, I got you 6 months later after they did something wrong. It should be an opportunity for us to talk about, here are your areas of strength and here are some areas that we need to work on. And it's a we because they are working with us. That means that we have an investment in this officer. If we are their supervisor, we have a responsibility, because otherwise are we involved in negligent retention of someone we knew was problematic and we chose to ignore it because we just needed that warm body in uniform. We should be working with our employee assistance program, with our peer support program, with our CISM teams, our critical incident stress management teams. Whatever of those groups we have, we need to make sure that they are well informed about officer perpetrated domestic violence and what they should be doing when that information is divulged. So we cannot have secret pockets of people who know about it and don't report it. We want to make sure that in an early warning system, that if that information comes to them that there may be problems within the home, that we look at identifying solvability factors to make sure it does not turn into a criminal case within that family or worse. So this is a big rub, because oftentimes what I see around the country is that the administrative investigation stands down. They wait until they see what happens with the criminal case. And I will tell you that we are doing it just backwards. Because if we're waiting for prosecution, we know that this is going to be a very difficult case. We know that the likelihood is that the victim, without a strong victim advocate, without a strong support system, without an agency that is also standing behind her, she is likely to recant or maybe even say that she lied about the investigation to the officer. That's why I love body cams. That's why I love recorded 911 calls. That's why I like in-car cameras, because that statement, if it was gathered during an excited point with that victim, we may be able to get her testimony into evidence if it was gathered in an excited state. So 911 dispatchers, please don't ask the caller to calm down. You may ask them to clarify the question, make sure that you're hearing, make sure that you get ambulance coming, find out if there is a firearm involved, not a weapon, but if we're looking specifically, if you want to know about guns, let's ask about guns. So we need to make sure that we have all that evidence and that we lock it down. And that means that those reports have got to be locked down so not everybody and his brother has access to it. That can collude and put even more pressure on the victim to recant or no longer cooperate with prosecution. So criminal cases, we had an officer on my agency who shot and killed his wife. I was one on the scene. And I know what we had there. I know what evidence we had, and yet he was acquitted. And to this day, it brings tears to my eyes when I talk about that case, because I know in my heart we didn't serve that victim well. I know in my heart that the system was broken. So that means that we could still go forward administratively. Administratively, what we know is that officers must be provided or must be given their Garrity rights, and it's a compelled statement. So they are forced to answer questions, they are forced to tell the truth, and if they lie under Garrity, they can be terminated just for that. Anything learned under Garrity, because it's a compelled statement, cannot be shared with the investigators doing the criminal case. But the opposite is not true. Anything gleaned in that criminal investigation can be shared with the Office of Professional Standards, and we could look at inconsistencies. The information under Garrity can be used to impeach an officer if they're standing trial on this type of case, and we know that they're lying based on their statement under Garrity. So we do know we have exceptions to the Miranda rights, that we have exceptions to sharing of that information when it comes to impeachment. But the administrative case is so important that it moves forward regardless of what happens with the criminal case. First of all, we don't have to have beyond a reasonable doubt an administrative case to terminate an officer. The same level of proof is not there with an administrative case. So you hire and make sure that not hire, but you make sure that the detectives assigned to that administrative case understand OIDV and can investigate thoroughly without bias, and then make their recommendation to the chief or to the Board of Safety or Civilian Review Panel. So under that administrative investigation, I mentioned this earlier, but it may be that an outside agency is conducting the investigation. I appreciate so much the Hanover College Police Department and the Indiana State Police who assisted with a case in Southern Indiana, where I testified as an expert witness against a police officer who had actually taken his firearm and put it to the mother of his child's head in the presence of their 3-year-old and his 6-year-old daughter by a previous marriage. And then it would go from putting the gun to her head to his mouth. And this was all recorded on a 27-minute audio. The Indiana State Police luckily stepped into that investigation and took it over. And I will tell you that it pains me to have to fight against an agency and their officers, but it is the right thing to do. And he was found guilty of those charges, and he was sent to prison, and he did lose his right to be a police officer anywhere in this country in the future. The chief or sheriff or the head of the agency can also issue an administrative order. So much like a no contact order that comes out of criminal courts, this is from the chief or sheriff saying that you are to have no contact with this person. You cannot email them. You cannot have a third party contact them. You cannot Snapchat, whatever means of communication. If you violate this, you may be terminated. And that administrative order does bear weight. It does have teeth. It's just whether or not we can get the head of the agency to issue that when they're still waiting on that criminal case to see what happens with that. And then lethality assessment. any officer-involved DV case, we must do a lethality assessment with the victim. I mean, the top 3 predictors using Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's Lethality Assessment Program that we use here in the state of Indiana, the top 3 predictors of homicide are, have they ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Have they ever tried to choke or strangle you? And do you think they might try to kill you? If that victim answers yes, or affirmatively to any one of just those 3 questions, and that's only the top 3 questions, they're at high risk for homicide. And yet our agencies oftentimes aren't doing lethality assessments with our victims to know what we should be doing for safety planning. And I own this. I've worked in law enforcement my whole life. That is not my area of expertise, safety planning, but we got folks on this call that are experts in that, and we've got to partner with them and allow them to conduct that lethality assessment and then listen to them when they tell us, based on this evidence-based tool, this person is at high risk of homicide and what we need to do to protect not only her, but also our agency from further liability. So victim advocates, they're so important. Now, here's one little caveat. If your advocacy program is paid by your law enforcement agency and housed within law enforcement, I ask for you to consider, in the case of OIDV, that you worked with a non-system advocacy group. So send them to another advocacy group within your county or a neighboring county for them to get assistance. In all transparency, we want to make sure that there is not any bias because the advocate may already know the officer who is accused. And then informing the victim that they have a right to file for a protective order, but also letting them know that should they file for a protective order, their life may be in further danger. That alone can be a catalyst for further violence. So we have to know that sometimes informing people of what their options are that look good may not be the best move for this victim whose perpetrator is a law enforcement officer, and we have to be transparent about that as well. So, of course, I love the 30 by 30 initiative, and I love the fact that we are diligently trying in this country to put 30% of our recruits being women in our recruit classes by the year 2030. Canada and Australia have already met that and beyond. But here's where we are in the United States. In 2008, I put together a presentation on women in law enforcement to try to recruit more women into our agency. And at that time, looking back on that slide presentation, I said 12% in the nation were women. And where are we today in 2024? We have not moved that needle one notch. We're still at 12%. And so in some agencies, this victim who's a female police officer may be the only one in the district, on their shift, or in the entire agency. So just think about that obstacle alone, wanting to assimilate, wanting to not be noticed as different than, wanting to just do your job, and people look at you, oh, you're a woman. And so they already question your ability. And now you're the only female who you believe to be experiencing domestic violence within your agency. So it's not enough just to bring women in the door, folks. We have to address sexual harassment. We have to address bias. We have to go back and address culture and climate. If we are truly going to welcome women into our agencies, then we've got to change the culture, and we have to say what we say and mean what we say. So we have to create a culture where women are heard and respected, and we're at the table. And if you're the fortunate woman who gets invited to the table, please just don't be an empty suit. Please use your voice. Please question what has always been, because law enforcement is steeped in tradition, and change does not come easy, but it doesn't come at all if we don't speak up. So David Brain was chief of police in Tacoma, Washington in 2003. He shot and killed Crystal Judson Brain, his wife, the mother of his two children, in the presence of his two children. And so many people said, what a tragedy. But in fact, it was quite the system failure. They were sued for $75 million. Now, I don't know what happens to your agency if you take that kind of hit. I'll tell you, they settled. They settled for like 26 million. So you take a $26 million hit. How many of you are getting more officers, or how many of you are going to be able to say that you have a legitimate police department? And he had failed two, not one, but two psychological exams. That's a system failure. Kim Carmack, police officer, Indianapolis, Indiana. Look at all the things that she did right and still ended up dead at the hands of her former husband. She had divorced him. She'd filed for protective order. She'd worked with her police department. He was on administrative leave. He broke into her house and murdered her. And I want to honor Bruce Bieber, who's on the call. This is his beautiful daughter, Abigail Bieber, who was murdered, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department, by Deputy Daniel Layden, who then took his own life by suicide. And it is informed, I have been informed, that this was not Daniel's first victim, a system failure. And this officer from Oklahoma, Cleveland County, Oklahoma, I just changed her name on the slide because I noticed that at her funeral, they buried her using her maiden name. And so I honor her using the last name of Pyle and not Vaughn. She was murdered by her husband, Deputy Vaughn Cannon, and he pled to her murder just a little over a month ago on September 14th. Indianapolis, Indiana, again. This was a familicide case. The daughter actually called in to say, my dad's shooting the whole family. And he did kill their mother. Both girls did survive this incident. And he resigned his position in May of 2024. And I'm still trying to learn why he resigned his position. And most recent one, Ellie from Orange County, Florida. She was murdered by her estranged former Sergeant Anthony Shea, who, after he shot and killed her, tried to stage the scene as a suicide. And I want to acknowledge those deputies and those officers who arrived on the scene that were able to see through the ruse and were able to show that, in fact, this was a staged crime scene, and that Sergeant Anthony Shea, who actually resigned because of improper conduct, unethical behavior on duty, resigned from the agency, has been charged with her murder. And folks, it just pains me to continue to find more and more cases that are involving officers, not only as perpetrator, but also as homicide victims. And so I want to end with a few things today. One, I want to end with this statement by a chief who just took office in 2022. This is an agency that I'm well aware, having been involved in expert witness testimony, that they paid out, I'll just say, lots of zeros on two different checks because their officers failed to protect victims of domestic violence when they responded to calls for service in their community. Recently, they had an arrest of a detective on 2 counts of domestic battery, and the chief came out with this statement. He said, when standards are not met, we not only compromise our legitimacy, but also erode the public's trust. He said it affects us all. Being a police officer, it requires each of us to live a life without reproach. I expect my officers to embody the values of integrity, respect, and fairness in both personal and professional lives. And he said, this is a critical not only to maintain the trust of the public, but also to preserve the honor of wearing the badge. And so his duty is to stand now to remain committed to transparency, impartiality, and ensure that justice is served. I honor Chief William Evans for that difficult statement, but one that he made to the news media that has been published, and one that lets the community know that police officers are not above the law. So here's what I want you to be thinking about. This is like your homework. It can't just be a few of us who are talking about this. We have to treat this as a crime and not a crisis. This is not a social issue. This is not a family matter. This is a criminal act within our officers' homes that we must treat as such. And how can we even begin to talk about officer wellness and ethics and safety if we don't address domestic violence within our police families? How is that not a part of that officer wellness program? And if you, as one person, think you don't have the ability to change, I will stand here and tell you you are wrong. I stand here as a survivor of domestic violence at the hands of a police officer. And why do I care about this so much? I care because of what happened not only to my career as I moved through that process of moving from victim to survivor, but also because once his agency was informed about the victimization in our house, they took note and then promoted him to sergeant. And that stuff is still happening today in 2024. We can do better. So it is my job, it is my task to tell the truth. In each of these 3 books, my stories were told. I will tell you that Crossing the Threshold was written at a time where I was not able to put my name to those words, but my story are amongst the pages of victims who came forward and shared their truth with Diane Wettendorf. Both those books written by Alex Roslin, I worked with him for months to talk about what needs to be told and the truth, and not just a smokescreen about the subject. In fact, this is what I said in 2015 in the book. I believe that the future of policing can truly change as we recognize that police perpetrated domestic violence exist, and we look at solvability factors to alter the systemic culture. I said that in 2015, almost a decade ago, and I'm saying it again today. So who's with me? Who's with us? Who's with LETTAC? Who's with Nolly? Who's on this call right now that says I'm in? If you're in and you want to be a part of this conversation in the future, please put your information in the chat. We are happy to have you as part of this conversation. And so I know we're out of time, but if you have any final questions or comments, I'd certainly entertain that at this point. All right, I've stopped my screen share so that we can get any questions or comments.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but if anybody wants to put one in, we are here. We're getting a lot of thank yous. A lot of great comments throughout.
And if anybody does have any questions that they want to ask offline, you're welcome to do that via the email addresses that have been shared. Both myself, Michael, and certainly Dottie as well. So. All right, well, given we're over by a few minutes and there aren't any questions coming in, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar, and to you, Dottie, especially for sharing such valuable information as well as your own personal experience. We hope to continue this important conversation with future webinars, conference sessions, and in-person events, as officer-involved domestic violence will not be a thing of the past unless we face it head-on. Please take this message back to your agencies and your partners, and let's work together to eliminate the significant officer safety and wellness and community trust issue. Thank you again, be safe, and please reach out to Nolly and LETTAC if we can ever be of assistance to you and your agencies. Have a great day.